So welcome to the Demography Today lecture series, sponsored by the BBVA Foundation and organized by the LOMPOP Project and the Spanish National Research Council. And we have the pleasure today to have here Jamie Pearce, Professor of Health Geography at the University of Edinburgh, where he's co-director of the Centre for Research on Environment, Society and Health, and director of the Scottish Graduate School for Social Science. Previously, he was a member of academic staff at the University of Canterbury, New Zealand, where was founding director of the Health Laboratory. He is editor-in-chief of the international journal Health and Place. Professor Pearce has published over 100 books, academic papers, and book chapters. His research seeks to understand various social, political, and environmental mechanisms operating at a range of geographical scales that establish and perpetuate spatial inequalities in health. Working at the intersection of human geography, public health, and epidemiology, he has particular interest in health-related behaviors, like smoking, nutrition, physical activity, and obesity. Environmental justice and health, like air pollution, green space, and multiple environmental deprivation, and macro-level health-related processes, like social and economic inequality. So welcome to the Spanish National Research Council. Jamie is as well part of our LOMPOP Horizon 2020 project. So this is something that probably he will be showing some of these things that we are doing inside the project. As usual, we have between 45 minutes to 1 hour for your presentation, and then we will open the floor for questions.
I'm also very pleased to be able to share some work with you that we've been working on at the Centre for Research on Environment, Society and Health at the University of Edinburgh. Some work that is attempting to hopefully say some new and I hope interesting things about the relationships between health and place. By bringing in a Lifecourse perspective, and something I'll talk about in a moment, something that's been rather absent from the literature on health and place. And what I'm going to be talking about is work that has come out of two projects that we've had funded over the last 3 or 4 years. First, the European Research Council project, which came to an end last year, and another project funded by the UK Research Councils called Move, Mobility and Place, again, which is just coming to a close. So I'm going to bring out some various bits of these two projects, which I hope will come together in a way that tells a bigger story, but you can be the judge of that. So, as Diego said at the start, I'm a health geographer interested in the connections between places that we live, places that we work, places that we play, and a range of health-related outcomes. And part of my role, part of the things I do is, as Diego said, is I'm editor-in-chief of a journal called Health and Place, which I recommend everyone to go off and read, of course. But if I think about the sort of materials we have coming into that journal, the kind of things that people are interested in, the kind of connections people are trying to make between health and place, and I guess representing what the whole field is about, I guess you could broadly divide it into two different domains. We could firstly think about the opportunity structures of places, the opportunity of structures of places. So this is things like secure and non-hazardous employment, it's things like housing quality, it's things like green spaces, which is something we're going to talk about today. It's things like the physical environment, so air pollution, noise, and so on, and the local public infrastructure, the services that we have in our local communities. So there's a lot of work that speaks to these different agendas and thinks about these sorts of connections, the opportunity structures. So you might think of these as kind of the material things, the things that we can touch and see and are quite visible in the places that we inhabit. The other kind of domain, the other kind of sort of work that we get coming into health and place is what you might think about as the social, collective social functioning and practices. And these are, I guess, the slightly more subtle and social aspects of places. So the local norms and values of what is normal behaviour in a particular place, what are the particular values in a community. We know things like the norms around smoking, the local norms around smoking, for example, are related to smoking prevalence in local communities. And that's true for other health behaviours as well. We might also think about social capital, the kind of connections and networks between people living in different communities, the sense of people belonging to different places. We know, again, relates to lots of health outcomes, perhaps most notably mental health outcomes. There's a sort of an emerging literature around what you might think about of neighbourhood reputation, the way in which places are stigmatised, the kind of which the public gaze upon places plays out and affects people living there in lots of ways, but including in terms of their health. And we might pick out other issues such as crime, and that's an issue that one of the long pop ESRs is particularly interested in exploring, the way in which local crime is a key issue in terms of understanding spatial differences in mental health outcomes. So collectively, you might think about these as the way in which places, the social functioning of places and the practices that play out in those communities. So I guess that's a kind of the 2-minute tour of what broadly of what people who are interested in health and place, whether they be geographers, epidemiologists, sociologists and so forth, they're the sorts of concerns that they've tended to focus on, at least over the last couple of decades. And we might also make I think what's quite a key point, something that geographers are particularly in, is that it's not just about those local particularities, it's not just about whether the neighbourhood you live in has a good park and is green, or it has low levels of air pollution, or has high levels of social capital. We also need to recognise, of course, that these sorts of issues are not divorced from much bigger structural factors. So, for example, we have a project just being funded in Scotland looking at the effects of the Great Recession on mental health outcomes, and then also the impact of the austerity agenda that came in. And I'm sure it's an issue that's very pertinent here in Spain. And of course, those are important issues, but one of the ways in which they play out quite critically is the way in which it affects local communities. So how do austerity-related measures relate to public services? How does that then translate into health outcomes? So we have to recognise that these aspects are situated within a much bigger story of a range of much wider structural factors. And then the final dimension here is temporal aspects of this. So how these things play out over time. We know that places aren't static. We know structural factors aren't static. And I guess from the geography literature, so going back to my roots in human geography, it's well established that we need to think about these, what we might call in human geography, the temporalities of places. That's established in a theoretical sense. But as we'll go on to talk about in a moment, I would argue being very much underexplored in an empirical sense, and that's what I hope one of the contributions I hope of the work we've been doing might start to make. So the outline of what I want to talk about, I just want to do 4 things really over the next 45 minutes or so. The first thing is to introduce the notion that was highlighted in the title of the talk, this idea of the life course of place. I hope I've already started to give you a little bit of sense and give you a sort of a few clues as to what I'm talking about, but I'll just try and specify a little bit more clearly what I'm talking about in terms of the life course of place, and why I think it's a kind of interesting tool, notion to help us understand connections between environments and health. And then secondly, I'm going to focus just on one aspect of place. And indeed, the work we've been doing as part of these projects is looking at a range of kind of environmental factors, or a range of place-based factors. But in order not to sort of try and overwhelm this talk a little bit, I'm just going to focus on one aspect which I think is particularly interesting, quite useful, and also quite topical in a policy context, certainly in the UK. And that's around green spaces, so green environments, green neighbourhoods. So I'll just talk to you about some of the work that we've been doing over the last 4 or 5 years around this, just very briefly, to then set up the sort of key part of the talk, really, which is about trying to operationalise this notion of life course of place. So the first bit I'll tell you about the kind of theoretical grounding, but in the third part I'll sort of say, how do we actually go about doing this? What's some of the ways in which we can start to answer some of these questions? And then more specifically, I'll give you some examples of how we've been doing this using a series of historical, geographical and map-based data in the UK, alongside some cohort information of a cohort born back in the 1930s. So I'll tell you about some of the results from that. So that's where we're going to go over the next little while. So life course of place, I've sort of started to introduce this term, that's something I've got interested in, and I'll tell you about what I see as being the key elements here. Excuse me. But if we first take a slight backward step and think about the work that's kind of emerged around population health, around understanding the key drivers of health outcomes in society over the last 20 or perhaps 30 or 40 years, in fact. And we think about the disciplines that have been driving some of this. I guess we've put near the top here disciplines, particularly like sociology, epidemiology, demography, of course, anthropology, politics, but of course other places too. And I guess collectively these disciplines, or people working in these disciplines, have posited all sorts of key explanations of what drives population health. What has driven the rapid increase in life expectancy over the last 100 years or so? Why is it we have big difference in health even between countries here in Europe, or indeed across countries within Europe as well? And there's a whole series of kind of theoretical perspectives. There's people looking kind of the cultural aspects. What is it about kind of cultural change that's led to health? There's people that are very much focused on behavioural factors. So it's all about smoking, if you smoke, what you drink, what you eat, and try and interpret changes in health in terms of those decisions that you and I take around our health. There's much more kind of materialist perspectives. There's a really large literature around kind of psychosocial interpretations of health. So this is basically arguing that differences of health are due to perceived inequalities between us in terms of often material circumstances. Then there's the very large literature again around the political economy of health, the sort of structural drivers of health. So the big picture economic, socio-economic changes that are often driven by central and regional governments, taxation, investment in services and so on, all these kind of much bigger picture issues that extend well beyond the health sector into every facet of everyday life. And then, of course, there's over the last decade or so, there's been a real interest in Lifecourse perspectives on health, which I'll say a little bit more about in a moment. But as a geographer, I guess I'm always alert to what is it about geographical ideas that have helped us understand health. And I guess there are probably three key contributions from geographers, or at least those interested in place and space, who have helped us understand health-related changes. There's a big literature, particularly in North America, around what we might call neighbourhoods and health. So this is basically looking at very kind of localised circumstances, the things that are around us and how that relates to our health, whether that be the infrastructure, whether that be the physical environment, the pollution and so on. There's a literature that's emerged out of the civil rights movement in the United States, but in the intellectual sense has emerged out of political ecology around environmental justice or environmental injustice. And this is really trying to get at what are some of the underlying explanations for why poorer, low-income, disenfranchised communities often have much poorer environments than those who are coming from more advantaged circumstances. So sort of trying originally in the literature looking at African American communities in the United States and why they often suffered some of the most disadvantageous environmental circumstances in that particular context. And then thirdly, the other kind of literature that's really come out of the geography world, or at least has been a big focus amongst geographers, has been the kind of mobility migration. So understanding how movements between different places account for some of the spatial differences we see in health, but actually mobility in itself is actually an important factor in terms of understanding, particularly where there's been forced displacements, but also how moving between different sorts of environments is potentially advantageous or disadvantageous for health. So that's something we've done quite a lot of work in the UK over a number of years, but not something I'm going to talk too much about today. So that's the kind of contributions to from the health geography literature. But what are some of the kind of problems here? What has been some of the critiques of the literature on health place? Well, I guess an obvious one, and perhaps surprising to maybe some of the people in this room, is that still a lot of the work has been cross-sectional. Still a lot of the work when we're thinking about health and place is very much looking at contemporary analysis, and there's very few attempts to try and look at these things longitudinally. And as we'll talk about in a moment, there is a good reason for why this has been quite challenging. But nonetheless, it's quite problematic that it's focused on contemporary, if you like, exposures, and there isn't a lot of longitudinal work. Or, when there is longitudinal work, it's been over very short time periods. So it might be that there are studies looking at interventions, so maybe the local council has gone in and changed the walking or cycling infrastructure, and then people have evaluated the impact in terms of cycling and walking in those communities. But they're usually evaluated over, at best, a 2, 3, or maybe, if you're very, very lucky, a 5-year period. And we know changes and things play out over much longer time periods. Or there is work looking at natural experiments, new housing developments, some of the regeneration initiatives of the early 2000s, particularly in a UK context. Again, looking at how we can use various changes that have taken place to try and understand how places are related to health. But I guess the obvious critique of that is that there's very little work examining environmental circumstances over much longer time periods, and particularly over the life course. And this is where this notion of the life course of place is hoping to make some inroads into these questions. I probably don't need to say too much about what life course is all about to a largely demography audience, but bear with me just for a moment as I try and set up the next bit. If we think about what life course theory has brought to public health and why this has actually been quite a significant contribution to understanding health outcomes over the last decade or so, we can see that there are all sorts of aspects of our well-being that are affected by factors that take place at different points in our lives. So we go right back to the start of life, even before we were born, and there's a literature out there that came out in the late 1990s showing, for example, that the nutrition, the alcohol consumption and smoking of mothers is related to various health outcomes of a child in early life. So we can already see that there's factors right before birth. This carries on into early childhood, where the child's various aspects of the child's life, such as their family structure, their household socioeconomic conditions, traumatic experiences. I'm sure you can name a whole long list of these factors. These kind of factors are also important in terms of understanding the individual's health. And we go on to mid-childhood, where we might think about the child's education, how well their education is going, then their own nutrition and physical activity, amongst many other things. And we can go on into adulthood, where we might look at hazardous employment, the type and nature of the work that people do, not just the actual nature of the job, but the security of the job that they have. We also know that to be important in terms of understanding health. And then perhaps most obviously all their income and socioeconomic circumstances in adulthood. And then finally, in older age, we can pick on lots of different factors here, but we might talk about the level of social support offered to people in the latter phases of their lives, the social capital, how well connected they feel within the communities that they're living. And all these things in a life course perspective may come together in an accumulative way, so all these things might sort of add up in quite complex sort of ways to affect a health. Or there may be particular moments in life where some of these factors may be more important. So some of the literature around traumatic experiences has focused particularly on childhood traumatic experiences. And maybe that's a kind of critical experiences when we're trying to understand that particular issue. But it may be at different stages of life as some of the other things listed there. And all this comes together in, as I say, in quite complex ways to affect our health towards the end of life. And these are just giving you a taste of some of the ways in which life course theory has been very influential in terms of understanding population health. So how does that literature, the kind of broad life course literature, relate to what I'm talking about, the kind of life courses of place? Well, it relates in a number of ways, but perhaps most fundamentally, if we take ourselves back to, I guess this is kind of really basic geography I learned as an undergraduate and has been written about by some really major geography academics such as Doreen Massey. I guess a key point from this literature that we all learned as undergraduates is that places are not kind of arbitrary, static entities, but in fact they're socially produced, they're highly dynamic, they change over time, and this change is often shaped by all sorts of factors such as political processes, power relations, who has decisions to change what, who is in control of particular circumstances. As I've already kind of made the point, this is not unrelated to some of the macro level processes that accumulate over decades, land use decision making, planning regimes and so on. And I guess the other point that's very well established in the geography literature is that we really can't pull apart, nor should we try and pull apart, the notion of environmental and social factors. They're very much interconnected when we're thinking about places, particularly in a public health context. So there's a very close connection between the two. Having said all that, recognising that places are very complex, they're highly dynamic, we also have to recognise that nonetheless, local particularities really can matter. They can matter in a public health context. So local particularities, what's particular in the neighbourhood or community that you live in, is likely to mediate relationships through local resources, the rules and practices of what's a kind of normalised behaviour, for example. And in turn, these can reinforce and rework place-based characteristics. So as I say, this has been quite a kind of a really well-researched, a really interesting literature over several decades in human geography, but hasn't really had any traction in amongst those interested in geographies of health. So where I would see this kind of notion of the life course of place, as I've already kind of made the point, there's very few studies tracking the historical development of places and then using that kind of information to inform understandings and our understanding of local health and well-being. Most studies are very much contemporaneous, and therefore, of course, got very poor, very weak understanding of how aspects of places might accumulate over time, or whether there are critical periods that affect people's health and well-being. We need, therefore, I would argue, to get much better at tracking people over time, and that's where something like LongPop comes in so well, trying to set up longitudinal data sets of people over time. What we're still lacking, even in the UK, where we are actually very fortunate in terms of some of the cohort information that does follow people over time, where we are lacking is actually some of the information around geographical specificity. So we might have quite a lot of information on people, questions that have been asked of them, maybe if we're lucky some clinical tests have been made of them over repeated time periods, but we don't really know too much about where they were. We don't really know how they use particular spaces. So that's definitely a weakness that we need to work on, and indeed that is something that's emerging. And then secondly, we also not just need to be tracking people over time, we need to be tracking places over time. And as you'll see as we go through this talk, that's something that is quite challenging. But I know that's certainly an expertise, I know in this building with Diego and his team. But my interest here is how we use that sort of information to actually understand contemporary health outcomes. And if you're interested in kind of the conceptual part of this rather than the kind of empirical bit of this, I just had a paper out in the Annals of the Association of American Geographers. So if you would like to know a little bit more kind of conceptually, then please have a read. I very appreciate any comments you have. Okay. Just to show you very simply kind of some of the ideas I'm trying to get at. I'm going to use a really simple example. I'm going to introduce you to Maddie. Maddie is my middle child, and this is Maddie a few years ago, maybe 4 years ago, when she was about 18 months old. And I want to kind of, I think one of the things about being a father, those of you parents in the room, or if you have parents, which I assume you all have, one of the things you'll know about being a parent is that it's important to map out your child's entire life for them. Not to give them any choices and just decide exactly how it's going to play out and be this domineering father. Not really, but that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm going to do here. So here's Maddie, and I'm going to map out her life for her. So here's Edinburgh. Here's the greater sort of urban area of Edinburgh. Here's the sea, the North Sea, going off towards Norway in that direction. Edinburgh in the southeast of Scotland. And when Maddie was born, I'll say about 4 years ago, we lived about there, just north of the centre, on the edge of Leith. People have been to Edinburgh. Leith, a very kind of highly changing, very fast-paced change, very industrial until about 20 years ago, but in the kind of post-industrial landscape of Scotland. Scotland been very hard hit by the industrial changes of the 80s and 90s. It's changed markedly. The Scottish Government has moved its offices, very large offices into Leith, and that's really fundamentally changed the character of the place. We then decided we needed a bit more space as our third child arrived, and so we moved slightly, a couple of miles, about 3 or 4 miles away, to the neighbourhood of Joppa, right by the coast, very different kind of ambience, living right by the sea, and very good in terms of kind of community resources, very kind of close-knit communities, a very kind of different sort of a place. So let's pretend that we decide to live there for the next decade as Maddie grows up. And then as a University of Edinburgh academic, the very worst thing your child could possibly do, the worst thing they can do to you as a University of academic, is to then make a decision about going to university, and for that decision to be to go to the University of Glasgow, the big rivalry between Edinburgh and Glasgow. So even though it's very hard to imagine Maddie making that terrible decision, let's go with it anyway. Maddie makes the move 40 or so miles west and studies for 4 years at the University of Glasgow. Again, a very different place, very different kind of physical environment, but very different aspects of places on the west coast. And then she does something even more stupid, and she decides that she had enough of Scotland and she wants to move to London for a few years to make her fortune or whatever. But again, London, a very kind of different political system, never mind kind of socially and culturally. And then, of course, she misses her dad so much, she decides that she wants to move back and lives in a couple of places in Edinburgh. So part of the story I'm trying to say here is that with Maddie, of course, this is just n equals 1, but if we scale this up across a population, we need to know about something about where Maddie has moved to throughout her life. So we need to know quite a lot of geographical specificity, but we also need to know something about all of these 6 places. We need to know how they change over time. We need to think about what features might be important to Maddie at different stages in her life course, and then to try and monitor and understand the changes, the local changes, the geographical changes that play out over time. And when we scale this up to maybe hundreds, if not thousands of people, of course, that's quite a challenging task. So there's Maddie. So sort of trying to get at these ideas, I suggested earlier, I've tried to introduce this idea of a life course of place, which is really about linking together life course literature with geographical literature. And I did a kind of a very short sort of think piece in the American Journal of Epidemiology a couple of years ago, which of course you're very welcome to look at. And it was interesting because this then prompted quite a testy debate between some academics in Australia who then picked up this idea, and with quite a strong critique of their work by a geographer based in Canada, and then a response by them. So it's actually collectively, particularly the social science and medicine series of papers, actually make quite an interesting debate about the kind of pros and cons of the life course of place. It really took on and extended the kind of my initial thinking on this into actually a really interesting debate. So do have a look at that if you're interested. And what I want to do in the sort of the remainder of the talk is actually say, how do we put some of these ideas around the life course of place into practice? As I said a moment ago at the start of the talk, I'm going to focus just on one aspect of place. So bear with me as I sort of try and talk you through a little bit about what we know on this one aspect, which is green space. And I pick on this because I think there's some quite interesting issues emerging from this, but also green space has a particular kind of policy traction in the UK at the moment. So it's quite an interesting area to be working in. And I'll tell you a little bit about more about that in a moment. So what do we know about green space and health in a Scottish context where we're working? Well, I guess the first thing to say more generally about green space and health is there's a big literature. It's a really kind of been a bit of a hot topic in the public health literature generally over the last 4 or 5 years. And now there's lots of evidence looking at how green spaces, so this is, whether you've got parks, open grounds such as golf courses or even fields and woods and so on. And indeed, actually, not just green spaces are slightly misleading in terms of also thinking about blue spaces, so living next to lakes and seas and rivers and so on. So, but how these natural spaces are linked to a range of physical health outcomes, but also mental health outcomes. So there's, as I say, there's a substantial international literature, including here in Spain, on that. And as the image there on the right suggests, it's also had quite a lot of policy traction. And it's been adopted by a number of countries in terms of urban policy making, not least by the WHO. So green spaces is really seen as quite a useful way to improve local population health, or one kind of mechanism for doing that. And some of the pathways that have been suggested for this are around air quality, so green environments lead to less air pollution. They absorb air pollution. Of course, they prevent air pollution in the first place. There's other kind of literature suggesting if you have a greener environment, this encourages people to be outside, to be more physically active, and of course that's good for our health. They also see green spaces as an opportunity for social cohesion, bringing people together, interacting and so on, and also as a form of stress reduction, which we'll talk about in a moment, sort of restorative aspects of green spaces. And thinking about this from a Lifecourse perspective, I just want to sort of show you a couple of examples from our own work. Firstly, looking right at the start of life, how green spaces have been related to infant outcomes, around childhood development a little bit later in life, and then thirdly, looking at adults to give you the sort of almost the full perspective. And then the final bit of work, which is sort of the main sort of findings I wanted to share with you, which is trying to look over the entire life course. And we're going to look at some work we've been doing on cognitive ageing and on mental health. So let's just quickly look at the ones earlier in life. There is good evidence to suggest that green spaces might be related to various early life health outcomes, perhaps most obviously, or at least easily collected, easily analysed, is birth weight. And there are a number of reasons for this. It may be psychosocial reasons, so as I was suggesting earlier, restorative spaces that therefore lead to maternal stress, so then that kind of benefit is shared with the unborn child. Physiological, so physical activity encourages the mother to be more physically, or helps the mother to be more physically active, and improve maternal health. And environmental, so reduced maternal exposure to environmental risk factors such as noise and air pollution, as we've already suggested, with benefits to the child as well. And that's my third child, just for completeness, to Laurie to get him in as well. So the work we've been doing on this, we've been trying to sort of think about what are some of the more robust methods given the availability of data. So the way that we went about looking at maternal exposure to green space and birth weight was a sibling study design whereby we're comparing the births to the same mother. And this is really advantageous because effectively you know that it's not going to be confounded, or it's not going to be confounded by anything that's non-time varying. So it's not going to be confounded probably by, say, mother's education, which is unlikely to substantially change between two births. It's probably the same for socioeconomic grouping and so on. So it's actually quite a useful study design, and by doing it at the national level, that suddenly becomes feasible. So we might think about this as a quasi-experimental design, similar to moving mothers from one environment to another between pregnancies, and then comparing the birth outcomes and birth weight. And that's what this diagram is trying to suggest. Here's the same mother in pregnancy 1, pregnancy 2, in slightly different environments. A little misleading because we don't get a lot of cacti in Scotland. You'll be surprised. In fact, we don't get much sun either, thinking about it. So slightly misleading, but you get the point that these are two rather different circumstances that the same mother is finding themselves in. And what we found was the total green space, so the overall ambient green space, so that's adding up all the different bits of public green space, plus the private spaces, seem to be much more important than just public natural spaces. So we're expecting it to kind of be the other way around. We're expecting those kind of public spaces to be really important in terms of encouraging mothers to be out there or expecting mothers to be out there and meeting other people, but no, it didn't seem to be the case. And again, if you're interested in this, it's just been published in the International Journal of Epidemiology if you want to know a bit more. So moving through the life course from babies to children, young children, this is looking at some work on early childhood development. Why would we expect green spaces to be related to early child development? Well, I guess there are 4 key mechanisms. Firstly, what we might call attention restoration theory. This is where experience in natural space may restore child's attention by giving fatigue cognitive processes the opportunity to rest. It's sort of restorative experience. It's not unrelated, the psychoevolutionary theory, something in the psychology literature. Natural spaces may support stress reduction through favourable physiological responses. Green spaces might also offer playful environments, which may offer increased opportunities to play, which in natural spaces is often more creative, adventurous, challenging types of play than we might expect in other sorts of places. And then finally, it might be actually nothing to do with the child directly, but it might be indirect. So it might be through the child's carer. So the child's carer might be having exposure to green space, which is linked to their mental health. In adult carers' mental health, and we know that carers' mental health can transmitted into early childhood development. There's lots of evidence of that. So there's 4 sort of possible mechanisms here. And so we've been exploring this in Scotland using a cohort called the Growing Up in Scotland study. So this is a group of children that were born in 2006 and have been followed up pretty much every year ever since. So there's now quite rich data on them, and we're just looking at the earlier data in this particular analysis. And what we found was that green spaces, but particularly private gardens, contributed to better social, emotional and behavioural outcomes. So that, or the change in those outcomes between the ages of 4 and 6. So that kind of really critical window in terms of child development, there did seem to be a role of green space, but particularly, and perhaps again slightly surprisingly, driven by availability of private gardens. And again, there's a paper that came out late last year on this in Environmental Research, if you want to know a bit more. And then thirdly here, what about in terms of adults? And here I'm just going to talk about a bit of work we've been looking at inequalities in health. And this is some study that's looking about how a broad set of neighbourhood characteristics were, whether they're associated with lower inequalities in mental well-being. So the question here is, can green space not only improve population health, can it also be a factor in terms of reducing inequalities in health, a process that we've called equigenesis in a number of our papers. We've done this using something called the European Quality of Life Survey, which is about 21,000 people across 34 European countries, and we looked at the relationship between a measure of mental well-being, a WHO scale of mental well-being, and individual measures of financial strain. We looked at a number of neighbourhood characteristics, but I'm just going to talk to you about green space here. And this is what we found. So if we can imagine along the x-axis, this is basically our income measure. So this is sort of how easy people find it to make ends meet. So this is sort of higher income groups, and this is lower income groups, and this is our mental health measure. So as we'd expect, as you can see, all these lines show that if you're find it easy to make ends meet, so you're a higher socioeconomic group, have higher income, mental health seems to be higher, and there's quite a strong gradient as we go down to those that find it difficult making ends meet. But the key point from a green space perspective here is to look at the gradient of those lines, and you can see there is some level of variation. And basically, it's those areas that are the greenest, or at least where access to green space seems to be much better, where there's a shallower gradient in terms of inequalities. So this sort of variation in the line, which may look quite small on a graph like that, in terms of that sort of improvement in health inequalities, that would make a very marked increase in inequalities. So it does seem to suggest to us that green space is part of a strategy for improving people's environments, improving their health, but also making some inroads into reducing these really sharp inequalities in health outcomes, at least in terms of mental health. And again, there's a paper published on that if you want to know some more. Okay, so that's the background of green space. Now the final bit, I really just want to talk a little bit how we've gone about trying to look at these things over the full life course, which I think is probably the key part of what we've been trying to do. And this is part of a study we had funded through the Lifelong Health and Wellbeing Programme of the UK Research Councils called Mood, Mobility and Place. So the question we've had to ask ourselves is, how do we go about constructing past urban environments? So we want to understand how urban environments matter throughout people's lives. We of course need this longitudinal data of places, but that's quite a challenging thing to do. But if we are able to do it, it will allow us to examine the influence of place over the life course and whether places accumulate or whether there are these critical periods. So we've been using, in terms of outcome data, i.e. the data of individuals, we've been using something called the Lothian birth cohort of 1936. So in 1936, all of the people in our study were born in 1936, but in 1947, when they were aged 11, every single child in Scotland, about 75,000 of them, sat the mental survey test. So there's this big room full of the mental survey test that people filled in 1947. And then about 15 years ago, some colleagues of mine in Edinburgh had the bright idea to try and reinvigorate and use this. And what they did was to go back and contact a sample of the 1936 born children in Scotland to see if they could make contact with them. But then to start to follow them up and ask them a range of questions around their cognitive ability, but also a whole suite of health outcomes, their social support, their networks, their friends, their neighbours, some really rich data. And this is roughly what the 1947 mental survey, the sorts of questions that were asked. And so this is the information we have of these participants back when they were aged 11. And so here's one of the participants, Kenneth, who, picture of him aged, he looks a bit older than 11 to me, but apparently he was aged 11. And then we've got a lot more data from 2006, 2009, 2012, 2015, and indeed there's more recent waves gone into the field already. So there's about just over 1,000 people, 1,091 people in the Lothian birth cohort, all born in 1936. And here they are, well here's some of them anyway, who are very engaged and come along to annual events. Here's Ian Deary, who's leading on the cohort, surrounded by happy, smiling faces of people who were then aged about 76 or so. But what was missing when we started this study from the cohort that we really needed was something about where those people were at different stages of life. And so what we did was to use something called the life grid technique, which is quite a well-established method in sociology, whereby you use a series of kind of memory prompts that are based on local, global and personal events to try and help people think about where they were at different times. So this is what a form kind of looked like, or part of a form looked like. We had a series of kind of key major political or other types of events that happened, the oil crisis of the 1970s, Margaret Thatcher becoming Prime Minister, the Falklands War, Lockerbie bombing, so on, Princess Diana dying, these sorts of things that we hoped would act as a memory prompt. And then we asked them to fill in an address whenever they changed address so that we could build up quite a rich picture. And this seemed to work very well. We seemed to get very good return on people recalling where they were. So that gives us the data we need about people. We know all the rich information in the Lothian birth cohort. We have pretty reasonable information about where they were over time. What's still missing is the geographical data. So this is where we spent actually probably about 2 years in the various archives around, not just Edinburgh actually, but around in Scotland more generally, trying to pull out some historical data around a whole suite of environmental factors. So things like this really major report that came out in the post-war period, a civic survey and plan for the City and Royal Borough of Edinburgh, which had very rich information, mostly as maps, but also as a series of tables for areas, and we were able to utilise this sort of information. Things like the Sanitary Department annual reports, which came out right through to the 1970s, contain really detailed area-level information around a whole suite of health-related issues, just as a couple of examples. And then we go through various extraction techniques, and this hasn't projected very well, sorry, but this is just looking at the public parks, some data we collected on public parks at various points in time through the 20th century, and we also have some very rich information from more recent times. And you can sort of see the growth of the city over time from 1914, the growth of green space, of course, also representing the expansion of the city boundaries as well. So you can see that most of the changes are additions in terms of public parks, but there are some notable places, important places, or important population centres where parks were removed. And this gives you a sense of some of those changes between the different time points. And again, you can see that generally there is a net increase over over each of the time points, particularly at the start of the study period. But clearly there are also places where there's been a net reduction in terms of green space. This rather visually unattractive graph is just trying to give you a sense of how this has played out at a local level. So here are some of the neighbourhoods in the Greater Edinburgh area, and this is just simply ranking them by the proportion of green space. And you can see that some places, some parts of the city, like Holyrood, if anyone's familiar with Edinburgh, this is where the great big mountain Arthur's Seat sits right in the middle. It's a great big public park, so it's not surprising that is number one ranked. It is almost entirely green. Other places towards the top there have been continually amongst the least green spaces over time. But there are some interesting kind of exceptions. Places like Craigmillar were distinctly ungreen at the start of the study period and are now very green. And what this is representing is the real kind of change in terms of land use. This was a former coal mining community, largely an industrial landscape, and then through particularly the last 20 or 30 years has gone through radical regeneration, repurposing of land use from industry to housing, and then as part of that, of course, including green spaces. So that gives you a sense of the data. When we bring them together, we can do things like this. So this is a hotspot map looking at individuals in the cohort. So these are just a selection of the individuals who are in the Lothian birth cohort. This is time going across here, and it gives you a sense that the types of places that people have lived in at different points in time. So this person here, number 120, started off in actually a place which was pretty lacking in green space, but in the latter part is actually been living in a place which is reasonably green. Others, such as this person up here, has constantly been living in an environment which has been sort of medium green throughout the study period. So we can start to build up this kind of interesting geographical picture of the kind of context in which people have been living. And as I say, I'm just showing you green space, but we've also got this sort of information for a number of other neighbourhood environmental factors as well, of which this is one example. This is looking at area level socioeconomic circumstances. Again, a similar sort of picture. There are some people who have lived in relatively low levels of deprivation through their life, other people who have lived in relatively high level deprivation throughout their life, and other people that have moved in and out of areas, rather distinct areas. So how do we then bring this together? Well, I just want to show you two bits of analysis, or give the results from two bits of analysis, which are looking at green space. Firstly, looking at cognitive ageing and the way in which the changes that people have in terms of their cognitive ability as they age, how that may or may not be offset by living in a green environment. And secondly, using the same population, looking at mental health outcomes. So asking this question, are there these sort of accumulative effects over time? Does the fact that you live in green spaces throughout your life, good green spaces throughout your life, have an effect on your cognitive ageing and your mental health outcomes in later life? Or rather, is it all about kind of critical periods? There are significant moments in life which matter for those two health outcomes. So looking at cognitive ageing first, when we looked at the relationship between green space at different points in time, whether that be through cumulative models, whether it be through critical period type models, and looked at that change between when they sat their test age 11 and and when they first entered the cohort at age 70 or became part of the cohort at age 70, there was no association. So in other words, there was simply no relationship between green space and that amount of cognitive change we see between the ages of 11 and 70. And that's maybe not a big surprise, because actually a lot of the change in terms of cognitive abilities is after the age of 70. It's reasonably stable through that time period for the majority of people. However, when we looked at the change between the ages of 70 and 76, there did seem to be a positive association with the change in the cognitive test score. And the key result here was that it seemed to be that childhood was a particularly sensitive period that affected cognitive function trajectory in later life. So in other words, if you lived in a green environment when you were a child, you had much better probability of being resilient to cognitive decline much later in life. So early childhood circumstances in terms of the places that people were living related to cognitive change much later in life. And there was a kind of an enhancement effect or interaction effect with green space in adulthood, but it was childhood that seemed particularly significant, and with stronger effects amongst women and those in lower socioeconomic groups as well. So that was, I think, quite an exciting finding for us. And again, if you're interested in reading a bit more, papers just come out in Social Science and Medicine on that work. And then the second bit, the second analysis, that's the cognitive aging. The second bit we were looking at, or interested just for the purposes of today, is around mental health. There's a nice photo of Edinburgh to whet your appetite, so you haven't been, to come and visit us on a sunny day, which happens all the time, of course. The mental health outcome we were looking at is something called the Hospital Anxiety and Depression Scale, and this is a well-used instrument in the literature, not without its critics, but a well-used instrument and clearly related to mental health morbidity. Asks a whole load of questions. Half are about anxiety, half are about depression, such as loss of interest, diminished pleasure response, and so on. And so the HADS, the Hospital Anxiety and Depression Scale, can be used as an overall measure, or used as an anxiety and depression measure too. So we've done all of those. And when we looked at the total HADS score, there did seem to be a relationship with green space, but this was mostly limited to the most socially disadvantaged groups. So having a green space during childhood was related to mental health much later in life. And to give you a sense of the kind of scale here, roughly speaking, a 10% increase in green space was related to a 14% reduction in the HADS total score. So a clinically relevant finding from a policy perspective. For anxiety, again, this was limited to the most socially disadvantaged neighbourhoods. Again, green space during childhood. But it was the accumulation model here that was also significant as well. So in other words, it just wasn't just about childhood. It seems to be that kind of accumulative effects throughout our lives. So living in a green space at every point in our life seems to be advantageous in terms of mental health, at least among those living in the most socially disadvantaged places. And paper, if you're interested, I can send you this. It hasn't actually come out yet, but there's a paper coming out on this bit of work in the Transaction Institute of British Geographers. So I'm happy to share that. Do send me an email if you're interested. Okay, so let's bring this together. I think my time must be, yes, it's very nearly up. So I've introduced you this notion of the life course of place. And hopefully I've started to convince you this might have a useful contribution to make to the public health literature. And where I see this fitting is responding to calls we've had for a long time in health geography about more longitudinal health place studies. There's been lots of kind of calls, there's been conceptual work done on this, but very few, in fact, no empirical studies looking across the full life course. And so that's what we've tried to do, look at how places influence health throughout the life course, looking at these critical periods, whether there are formative experiences early in life, whether there are cumulative influences, and of course, actually, the other thing I haven't said very much about here is actually give some quite stronger some stronger evidence of causal relationships between place and health, which, of course, cross-sectional studies are lacking in. I also hope that this has contributed to the geography literature more generally, not just in the public health literature, about the role of place in establishing and perpetuating inequalities. To think about how historical processes, things that have played out in places over time, interact and interplay with human lives. I also think the literature is something we're working on at the moment, and actually writing a paper around this, that how this can help to inform the environmental justice literature. So thinking about how places change around people, and how people move between different environments through their lives, and what the implications are for health. And we can ask all sorts of questions, such as who's locked into particular environmental circumstances, either by issues relating to their own individual circumstances, or because of the environments, the changes in the environments around them. Should just note a couple of very important limitations that we're talking about. There are issues, of course, of recall bias. So we can't estimate precisely in terms of the address data that we collected. There's also a survivor bias potentially issue with the loathing birth cohort, because of course we're working with the survivors, those that can actually respond to our questionnaires. The loathing birth cohort is relatively low in terms of mobility. This is quite a stable population in terms of where they've lived their lives. And also there's limitations in terms of the area level constructs. There are some things we wanted to do, some analysis, some things we wanted to collect that proved just too tricky. We couldn't, for example, work out a robust way to look at area level social capital over time. We could think about ways of doing it at different points in time, but not ways that were really comparable. And of course, there are some of the things we're looking at, some of the geographical constructs we're looking at, the meanings of those will change over time. So, for example, we use some information around overcrowding, household overcrowding. And of course, household overcrowding in the 1930s, the norms around that are rather different than they are in 2018. And also there's issues around reporting units, which of course change over time. We've had to come up with ways to circumnavigate that as best we can. But also, I guess, not just methodological issues, there's some conceptual issues as well. Whilst trying to get at the kind of dynamics of place, we've still got to recognise we're taking static snapshots, albeit repeated static snapshots of places, when of course they are continually churning, evolving, indeed over very short time periods. And as Gavin Andrews in his commentary that I talked about earlier said, we do also need to have some methodological innovation about trying to capture this complex multidimensionality of places alongside the type of work that we're doing here. So what are the next steps for us? What are we working on at the moment? Well, we're currently doing some work looking at what you might think about as more complete environmental assessments. So rather than kind of quite static neighbourhoods as we've done so far, actually looking about where people go at different points in time, where they go to school, where they go to work, and so on. We're also trying to broaden the wider set of environmental characteristics. We've collected some of the data. We've been doing some of the analysis over the last few months. We're also looking at ways we might scale this up. So we've focused, for perhaps obvious reasons, on one region of Scotland. That makes it much simpler in terms of trying to collect the geographical data. But we're looking at ways we might be able to scale that up to use some of the national data sets, such as the British cohorts, such as the Scottish longitudinal study. And so as part of the Administrative Data Research Centre, which I know Diego knows about, we've been trialling some auto-extraction mapping techniques. How do we pull out key features and maps from different time series that might be relevant in terms of health? And I guess also throw this out there, that it would be really good to try and think about international comparisons. Would it be possible to do this sort of work in Madrid or in Spain or anywhere else indeed? So, conclusions. I've hopefully made the case that historical contexts or eras are rarely acknowledged in health geography research. There's a lack of robust evidence and data, so this Lifecourse of Place Notions trying to contribute to that. Hopefully said something interesting around green space and how this is related to all sorts of health outcomes in a Scottish context at least, though a lot of these things stand up in a Spanish context as well, I should note. Birth weight, developmental outcomes, mental health outcome, cognitive ageing, and something I didn't really say too much about, not for physical activity, interestingly. In Scotland, there doesn't seem to be a relationship between green space and physical activity. It's something we can talk about more if you're interested. I guess we've also shown, of course, perhaps a bit more, drilling down a little bit further, green space matters at different stages of the life course. Green space environments in early years have lifelong implications for health, at least in terms of cognitive ageing and mental health. And of course, all of this has some policy implications, particularly around child health and development, cognitive ageing, inequalities and resilience. And all three of these issues are part of the national framework in Scotland, i.e. the 16 priority areas in Scotland, the ageing society, inequalities, and how can we make a more resilient Scotland, are all hot on the political agenda in Scotland, and indeed actually, of course, in terms of EU policy making as well. Must make some important acknowledgements. Mark Cherry, who's been the postdoc working on this project for the last couple of years, my colleague Niamh Short, who I work with at Creche, Ian Deary, who leads on the Lothian birth cohort, Catherine Tish, who was our research assistant, collecting a lot of that, doing a lot of that hard work, sitting around in archives, working away in our archives, and then Catherine Ward-Thompson, who's a collaborator on some of the studies I've been talking about. And I think I've already said this was work supported by the Lifelong Health and Wellbeing initiative of the UK Research Councils and a 5-year European Research Council grants. And there's a very long list of rather boring looking papers if you're interested in knowing a bit more, and how to follow us on Twitter. But that's it. Thanks so much for listening. I hope that's of some interest.